Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second in this year's series of SAFPAC seminars. Delighted that we've got Mo Mandic here, who's got a book that's just come out entitled
Psychotherapy and Existential Therapy.
Right, so you're in the right place. Right? Mo also happens to work at Regent and at the New School, I think. Which of course both existential trainings and works particularly in private practice in West London. And now you're just going to talk about formal indication, which you claim to be a basis of existential therapeutic approach.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking at the moment. Yeah.
Could you say more?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Just to say, I'm really pleased to be here. It's I don't get these opportunities very often. I just feel that it offers me the chance to perhaps just say what's on my mind and explicate, hopefully, and try to make myself as understandable as I can about existential therapy, the way that I've kind of come to understand it at this point. I've been a therapist for some years now, and I've been through all the trainings and all the big names, from Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, and so on and so forth. But I just want to say from the outset that Martin Heidegger has been really the most influential figure within that whole movement for me, because I hope you'll be able to see that he's offering something that's very different and much more thorough than all the other thinkers have been able to provide, mainly because he's so in tune with the question of thinking itself, and also he's mindful of what we might call methodology. That already kind of puts it into a certain kind of form of language that I feel a bit uneasy with, but let's just use that for now. It's a particular kind of way of conducting his thinking along a path that he takes up and pursues as far as he can, and comes to a point where he realizes that's as far as he can go, and then just kind of puts it to one side, and then he takes another path and he pursues his thinking along that path, takes it as far as he can, lets go of that, and he keeps going. So there's no kind of definitive statement or endpoint that he identifies as characterizing the fundamental question, really, which is that we're all hopefully trying to address, which is, what is it to be human? In fact, I think that if there's anything about a more kind of philosophical approach or philosophical orientation to therapy, it's trying to bring into the learning or discussion that whole question: what is it to be a human being? And we've already established it, as it were, through the modernist approach, since I take it the 1600s, what a human being amounts to, what a human being is. So what I'm about to talk about, really, I think, is a radical change or transformation in that whole way of thinking about what it is to be human. To bring that down and to make that work, if you like, it's required, at least on Heidegger's part, introducing some neologisms or words that are drawn from German language, German thinking, that were there, that he's appropriated and reassigned a certain meaning. So in order to really break with the established way of thinking and talking, that's extremely difficult if you're reading his well-known tone, Being and Time, because he's trying to extricate himself from the very language that we're accustomed to using and introducing something else but at the same time entrapped in the very language that we're using. We speak in terms of the subject and predicate, in terms of, if you've studied linguistics, I haven't, but there's something about the way language is structured, where we talk about Dell is in Arthur's cafe, the subject predicate, and it's all built around a particular grammatical structure. So we're locked into that structure, already articulating what is to be human in terms of the kind of way in which language is set up. So how hard we try to, get out of that and elbow our way out of it. It's extremely difficult. We have to do something very radical. And I wasn't planning on saying this, but there is something about being a time that's a kind of expression of the difficulty of that, and ultimately ends up in a failure. So it doesn't mean that it's not worth reading. I would really strongly recommend reading it, because it's a roller coaster. It really is, and it's just chock full of ideas, and not just ideas, but a way of thinking that takes you along a certain path, as I said, that illuminates something. And one of the key things, methodologically speaking, about being in time is that he uses this term, this approach called formal indication. He doesn't explicitly name it, only in one or two places, but he's reluctant to say, here I am using formal indication. He'll say something like formally indicative or something like that, but you won't get to see that unless you've read some of the work that he's written or lectures that he's given before 1927 when the book came out. So for me, formal indication is a really important element to understanding how we can work as therapists, how we can at least think about working as therapists, even if we go through the process of considering, understanding formal indication and saying, well, maybe that's not really, that doesn't fit for me. So what I'm going to try and do in the time that we've got is to try to kind of slow it down and to set it up so that at least I feel I'm on track in terms of opening this up in a way that provides us all with a chance of seeing what this amounts to, what this actually means, how it looks, that kind of thing. So the very first thing that I think is important is, rather than conducting a scientific investigation or some kind of theoretically oriented approach to try and characterize a human being, there's a starting point that I think is really important and that Heidegger adopts, takes up throughout his whole life. And it's this idea of questioning. So it's not the idea of, a question, I have a question, or something like that. It's a verbal sense of questioning, a continual process of questioning something, and starting somewhere, which typically is, whatever the topic happens to be, whatever the phenomenon happens to be, whatever it is that he's addressing, he's saying, well, what do people generally think? Where do we start from? What's the common everyday way of understanding whatever it might be? That's the starting point that we can take up, so that we can, have a way in to what he calls in being time, the hermeneutic circle. But it's the access to that will provide a way in which he can then take up the path and conduct his questioning. So I think for me, it's a really important element. The more you get into Heidegger, the more you see that questioning is key. A particular essay that he wrote is called "The Question Concerning Technology." So it's not, what's the answer to the question? The question is technology. What's the answer? It's a process. You can read the essay, and it's a very challenging piece of work because you ease your way into it at the beginning. but then it gets very complicated, even for Heidegger scholars, I think. But the starting point is the questioning process. So that is a questioning concerning technology. And in the same way, I just want to sort of alert that so you keep that in mind, that this is a process that we as therapists are engaging in. The questioning, when a client comes to us with the questioning, the opening up, you know, I'm not sure what you mean when you use that word. It might be that they use a word that we all understand in a sense, you know, the everyday sense of guilt, for example. But they're using that word. It's not our choice. It's not the word that we are introducing. So we're inviting the client to elaborate on it, open it up, and that's a question. By the way, if you want to stop me at any point, I'd be really happy to hear any comments or questions. I'd like it to be collaborative rather than me sitting here sort of spouting what might not mean anything. So what is the essence for me is a key term, and it's, again, he's using this language. You know, when I think of what is the essence of being human, for example, I think, well, you know, define it for me. Give me the essence of being human. But he's using a term, and this is typical Heidegger. He takes a term and he turns it 180 degrees, so that from it being a static kind of, you know, noun-like word, it's got something of the verbal, you know. So when he uses this word, which, you know, throughout philosophy, going back to the Greeks, has been used and introduced, Heidegger takes it into that kind of pre-Socratic, the likes of Heraclitus, the likes of Parmenides, Anaximander. You know, he draws on these guys because they were onto something, and we've lost that since Plato and Aristotle. But that word essence for him is not, you know, what's the function, what's the functionality of the chair, you know, what's the essence of the chair? Well, the chair is called sitting on. That's the essence of the chair. That's the traditional kind of way we think of it. But for him, it's what's the temporal unfolding of whatever it is that we're asking, X. How does that temporally unfold? So the question, or the essence, if you like, of technology, to use that title in the essay, was actually, how does technology temporally unfold? How does it unfold? How does it actually happen in its temporal sense? You know, how does it grip us in the kind of way in which it happens temporally? And that's the question that I think I like to start from. Well, what is this sense of being human? And in the term human being is the word being. And for Heidegger, this is the key. You know, his life project was on addressing being, or questioning. What sense do we have of being? So you'll open up being time. If it's the Macquarie and Robinson translation, it will be translated as what's the meaning of being, which isn't a good translation, because the German word Sinn means sense. So what's the sense? What sense do we have of being? And Heidegger's trying to go right to the basics by asking this question of what sense being has. And the way that I think we can sort of understand it is being there are many ways of being, you know. And let me give you some examples. I can say the table is round. I can also say that the lizard is moving. I might say, again, to use my example, Del is in Arthur's cafe, or Del is a therapist, or whatever. And I might also say something like the work of art is displayed on the wall. What each of those particular statements have in common is what it is. But they're not, even though they're all the same, they all have a different sense. So the table is round. That is of the table is round. It has a different sense to delis in the cafe. Or the lizard is lying on the stone. The work of art is manifesting something, but it's a work of art that's shining in some way, unlike all the other examples. So that word is doing a lot of work, but it gets dismissed because I say, well, you know, John is at home today, Mo's here, and that gets overlooked. But the very core of really what we're trying to explore is in each of our cases as well, being. What is the sense of being? How have I kind of made my being into some kind of core view? How have I made my being manifest? How have I actualized it in the way that I have? So that sense of the table is round, lizard is moving, have different, and the work of art have different senses of being. To John is at home, John is here, or wherever it might be. Because you think about human existence, that needs to be unpacked. You know, that sense of is for the human being needs to be unpacked in a way that shows how complex human beings are. We're probably the most complex beings on this planet. And that should kind of imbue us with a sense of humility. Because if I'm working with a client and I'm trying to support and engage with a client, there's the real challenge, you know, of my attempt to try and engage with them in conversation. But their being, you know, is the way that they've uniquely put it together, actualized it in the way that they have. And I'm trying to stay with the challenge of engaging in a conversation to explore what they bring, how we might engage in conversation, how we might open the exploration, how we might invite a sense of inquiry, of questioning, with the attempt to come to some kind of understanding, the understanding that the client can gain, some kind of clarity. So that kind of hopefully makes that distinction. And if you just keep that in mind, maybe the simple distinction between the table and the human being, hopefully you'll get a sense of how the human being starts to show itself in a certain kind of way. So just very quickly, the prevalent understanding of being. I don't know how I really don't know, you know, what kind of experience you have, you know, and what kinds of conversations you have on the trainings or over, you know, of course, if you work as therapists. But the sense that we have is really immersed in a kind of Cartesian framework. That's the traditional way that we've come to understand what is to be human. That there's a subject and object. There's a body and mind. There's internal, external. There are concepts. You know, we talk in terms of concepts. The way in which, if you don't know, René Descartes, he was a French mathematician and philosopher. He reconfigured philosophy. He didn't just articulate something. He transformed something in terms of the thinking that was going on. It's well worth reading it. It's really easy to read Descartes if you take up a copy of his meditations. Six meditations, and he takes you through it, and you can't but marvel at the way in which his thinking is so, you know, straightforward, but I argue is also open to questioning. That's what we're meant to be doing all the time. But there's something about really taking my cue, I guess, from from reading Heidegger way back, where Heidegger was sort of addressing the question of, well, okay, this is what Descartes says, but what's wrong with this? What's missing from this? If we understand ourselves in terms of being subject or body and mind, that's been set up in a particular way. I'm a thinking thing, so that's the way Descartes put it. But in saying that we're a thinking thing, he already brought into language, as we continued with his thinking, the idea of consciousness. That was how consciousness was introduced, through Descartes' language and thinking. So consciousness hasn't, as a term, hasn't been around forever and ever. It wasn't around at the time of the ancient Greeks. It wasn't around before. There was something else that Descartes was really emphasizing or pursuing. His line of inquiry was epistemological, which means that it's knowledge, let's say. It's the theory or the pursuit of knowledge, the basis of knowledge. How do we understand knowledge? How does it work? This is, epistemology is a branch of philosophy. If you go to any university or any course in philosophy, you will study epistemology. That would be part of the curriculum. But Descartes' focus was on epistemology, or an epistemological approach, because he wanted to establish really firm foundations for the kind of being that we are and understanding ourselves. How do we get to know ourselves? How do we understand the human being? So that's just maybe just to mention that. But the other thing is just to go back to being. When we reflect on being, if I stay with the chair that I mentioned, or the table, let's say, the way in which we can ask, how is the table disclosing itself in its being? Bit of an abstract, difficult question, because that's not what we're used to saying or articulating. That's not the way we commonly speak. But it's being. Just as I mentioned, the being of the table, the being of the lizard, being of the human being, being of the work of art, and you can go on and on and on. I've just given you 4 examples. But the being of the table, how does that being gets disclosed? And the being of the table is kind of disclosed or shows itself in 2 ways. Its being shows itself either as ready to hand, which is a term that Heidi is using. So I can use a table to write on. I'm using it in a certain, it's got its use. It's available. And it's not something that I'm constantly aware of or vigilant about. It's kind of withdrawn, as it were, from my awareness. You're not aware of sitting on the seat, but it's got its use. It's ready to hand. And so it necessarily withdraws, because in being able to use it, it has to be reliable, and you can't keep wondering whether it's going to support you, whether it's going to enable you to fit. It has to, as it were, do its work in being a chair. So it's ready to hand in that sense. That's the way, one way that chair is being a chair. Another way that being a chair is what Heidegger calls present hand, and that's when I look at the chair and I think, how is that chair designed? Or is that chair going to support someone if they sit on it? I'm focusing on it, and I'm isolating the chair from everything else and focusing specifically on that chair. So that's another way in which, as it were, the being of a chair is showing up as present at hand. Why I bring this in is because things show up in their being in a way that's different to the human being. Human beings show up, disclose their being as existence, and that's the term that we're we're familiar with. But Heidegger's got a particular kind of sense of it, which now, once he's introduced the term, saying, well, to be human is existence, that's the being, that's the sense of being that humans have. Now we can unpack that. Now we've got existence as opposed to ready to hand, as opposed to present hand, and so on and so forth. All these different ways of being. Is this okay so far, or is anyone wanting to ask anything? Okay. Let me see. The thing about it now is that now that we've got to existence, is how do we approach this? How do we conduct inquiry? How do we fall into a way of pursuing inquiry about the human being that doesn't kind of treat it as an animal, which is how Aristotle, thought that's the rational animal or an animal, and pursue it on the lines of that way of thinking, or as an object, or as a thing in itself. This is Kant, if you've heard of Immanuel Kant. This is another philosopher who's kind of articulated and extended Descartes' thinking and brought in his own thinking. But how do we, if we're gonna kind of conduct an inquiry into the human being, we can't treat it as an object. We're not an object. That's not gonna pass muster. That's not gonna do it. So there's got to be some other way. And one thing that needs to be borne in mind is that the human being is, and it's again a common term that we use, but Heidegger means by it something very different in a sense. The human being is care. So what does he mean by that? Well, it's our being. My being is an issue for me. That word issue is a bit clunky, I guess, but it matters to me. My existence matters to me. I'm not indifferent to it. I take a stand on my being. Even if I'm sitting at home at rest and watching TV or whatever I'm doing, I take a stand on it. I have to bear my being in some way. That I conduct my being in some way or other. And so I give a damn about my being. I care about it in that sense. So something, the structure, of being human is care. The stone, the chair, the table. There's no sense of care. That's the distinction. Care can't be attributed to the table or chair. So there's something particular about us that we can say, well, this is our kind of starting point. And if you were to kind of extend that and you were to get towards the end or the second part of being time, you would then see that Heidegger elaborates on that idea of care, structure of care. But care is temporal. That's the sense that care, why care is care, because it has something of the temporal. And you can sort of engage with the temporal, as it were, dimensions, the sense of the past, the present, future. There's something about the temporal kind of grounding, as it were, what care is about. But I'll leave you with that, because I won't really delve in that too much. It gets quite kind of complicated. In everyday language, we talk about healthcare, and we have medical, non-medical care. We talk about health and illness. So we're kind of already, familiar with the term care. But as I say, just to stress again, there's something about starting with care from Heidegger's position, which needs unfolding, and that's really the basis of being in time. That's what happens as he's working.
Mind if I
please
say something? It reminds me he speaks about concern
as
well.
That's right.
And I'm trying to think now in what section of being in time. I can't. It's not coming to me. But I don't know if you can say anything about it and if that's related to care.
I'll definitely come upon it. Well, you want it now?
Well, I mean, if it's coming, then let's hold off.
If I don't get to it, I'm sure I will, but remind me and come back. Okay. So I've been labouring on this a bit, but it's not going to be science. It's not going to be some kind of technological approach that's going to get us to illuminate something about the way in which care is structured in, it's kind of more elaborate ways. It's not going to be some kind of pragmatic approach. It's just none of these things are going to work really. I'm just thinking of some of the more directive approaches, not necessarily falling within therapy even, but just ways in which we succumb to science. Even if it's a subtly kind of subtle way of appropriating science in order to attain some kind of certainty about understanding who or what a human being is. That kind of some sense of science can come into the way in which we articulate or theorize about the human being. And to my mind, that already kind of deviates from staying with the question, trying to explore the sense of being human. So the human existence, as opposed to the chair again, to go back to the chair on the table, human existence has a kind of there, as it were. It's already given. There's a sort of, I'm already there. I'm, how can I put this? I'm spatially here in the room already. It's not something that I add, as it were. I come imbued with a sense of being spatially oriented. I'm also temporally oriented. I'm here now. And so something of the there, being situated, being thrown already, is a kind of reflection of a there that's central to being human. That isn't potent or relevant to the chair. The chair doesn't have a there that is kind of that is concerned. It is concerned with. We do. There's something about being there that's at the core of being human. And in fact, that's the term that Heidegger uses, which is being there. And we've retained the German term Dasein because, for whatever reason, there's some of a significance to trying to retain some of the language and the meaning that's imbued in that word. But if you can get a sense of being there that's particular to human existence, that involves situatedness, involves being in a context, being in a world, the world of theatre, the world of art, the world of therapy. That's the sense of world that I have. It's a context of meaning, it's a horizon of meaning. And we're always in a world. So we're always in a there, as it were. And that's what he means by being there and the word Dasein. So being there, Dasein, that's basically, being there is the translation of Dasein. So I stand out in my existence, I kind of, I'm moving outwards. Even if I'm sitting here, I'm kind of pointing outwards, as it were, standing out in some way in terms of that existence. The next thing I want to just mention is really the thing that you asked about, which is concern is one of many, many constitutive elements of human existence. So the term that Heidegger uses that reflects these constitutive elements of human existence is the existential. So it's got an E on the end. So if you take the word existential and put an E on the end, that's the way in which we read it when we read English translations of being in time. So just to say again, the existential is existentials are those elements that constitute us. So one existential is that we are in a world. That's an existential. We are disposed in certain ways. We're always in a particular disposition. So a common way of putting it is to say we're always in a particular mood, and that mood might be the mood of the room, the way in which the mood manifests in the room. It might be about the way in which we live our lives, the way in which I live in a mood of anger. I spend my whole life, as it were, living under this kind of background disposition of rage and anger. Something unfair has shown up in my life, and I'm resentful, I'm angry. The mood of anger manifests, grips me. I see everything a certain kind of way, through this kind of mood. And that's that. So these are existentials. I can read out. There's 20, in fact, that Heidegger identifies in Being and Time. Not because he's fully and finally, identified all the existentials that we can attribute to ourselves, or we can think of that pertain to us. Is that he's in a rush to get this book out. Incidentally, he wrote the book in about 6 months, perhaps not even 6 months, because he was in such a rush to publish it, so that it would be accepted, and he would be accepted for the chair at the University of Freiburg. And so it was, it was an intense period where he collected all his papers and lecture notes and everything else, took them with him to the place in Schwarzwald called Tottenauberg, and basically had a cabin there where he went with his family. But he just rented a little place just down the valley from the cabin where he used to spend a lot of time, and just spend days on end working on Being and Time and trying to really hammer it out. And it was really intense. He'd be working 12-hour, whatever, days, just writing it to get it out. But to go back to what I was saying, these existentials were introduced at certain points in Being and Time that were really only a way of serving him, so that he could get the work out, get to identify, okay, this particular existential is relevant to what I'm talking about now. This is the existential. Now another one, now another one. So it's not about him kind of listing, all the existentials that we can name about being human, but only those that are relevant to the project of Being and Time. But it's still very rich, that we've got, he's identified a number that make us really reflect on, what it is to be human in terms of the way in which human being, as it were, Dasein, being there, is structured through these existentials. So being involved, and the way he puts it is being in, is one existential. I'm always already involved, immersed in the world. And that's a kind of big term, and it needs unpacking. But for now, let me just mention these. So being alongside. That's another existential. Am I being alongside entities, other things, alongside the whatever it is, the screen and so on and so forth. But it's alongside entities or things or objects, or whatever you might call them. So that's the sense of being alongside that he wants to convey. The third is concern. It's not the kind of, I'm really concerned about, what's going on in America today. It's more about if I'm going to do some shopping after this, and I go around, I don't know, Sainsbury's, and I've got a basket, it's what do I need? I'm kind of immersed in, engaged in what's there, what do I need? Oh, okay, gluten free, where's that? and I'm kind of moving around, and I'm in that sense concerned. You know, there's a sense of concern, a sense of preoccupation, if you like, being moved in a certain way, but it's towards things again, objects and so on. He really dedicates that term concern, Sorgen, to things, because he's got a particular term that he uses for human beings. So when I say concern for human beings, the idea that's not the right way to put it. The fourth term is worldhood. So again, as I mentioned, we are worldly beings. We are worldly in the sense that there's always a world. So the way that I've understood it, you know, is that for me that world, that existential is so key, because in it is a sense of mapping out how the particular worlds that we're in have meaning for us. So as a therapist, I'm in the world of therapy. Three elements, as it were, three aspects in the world are relevant, pertinent. One is that being in that world of therapy gives me an identity as a therapist. Second thing is that I'm equipped. So I use the word equipment. The sense of I'm equipped with all the various things that, if you like, I use, I need, that are relevant to being a therapist, clients, therapy room, reading books, going to conferences, coming here. You know, that's my world of therapy. And that's, in a sense, what we might can attribute to or understand about that term equipment. The third is projects. You know, I have a project. It's not so much that I've kind of, you know, got this kind of project like an architect or a builder might have, you know, I've got to finish this house or something. It's a sense of ongoing possibility. I'm kind of ongoing in maybe teaching or supervising or seeing clients, and it's an ongoing kind of project that I, you know, engage in, so those three elements make up that world, as it were. And the interesting thing about it is really, as a therapist, is to sense where a client might be coming and saying, well, you know, I'm going through a particularly difficult time at this point. It might be that their world has somehow become, let's say, fractured or distended or distorted or disrupted, or whatever word you might want to use. And you can identify one or more of those things that might be relevant to how that world has become disrupted. I'm questioning my identity. If say, I can no longer work as a therapist, or something's preventing me in some way, you know, my identity is in effect in crisis. I'm wondering, you know, how do I make sense of this? I'm kind of feeling very disoriented. Or in some sense, I don't know how, but if there's something about, you know, I don't feel I have some kind of way of equipping myself with being a therapist in that world. Or, you know, I just lost the sense of meaning or sense of motivation to be a therapist. You know, my projects have kind of collapsed. So that world is vulnerable in some way. So that for me feels quite relevant to understanding myself and my clients in terms of how world is an important element of being human. All these existentials are things you can see. And this is the point I'm going to try and get to. Hopefully, I won't run out of time. But you know why formal education becomes really important. Very quickly then, the rest of the existentials, existentiality. I'll just mention these: directionality, making room, being with. Probably already know that. Mitsein, being with others is Mitdasein. So he's using these words and showing how we're already, always already with. Even if I seclude myself in a little cottage or cabin in Wales somewhere, and I'm on my own and there's no one around, I'm still being with. You know, it's woven into the fabric of my being. Solicitude. So that's the distinction between concern and solicitude, because solicitude is a caring, a certain kind of caring, and caring towards others. That might be, as therapists, something that you want to explore if you get a chance, because he talks about leaping in and leaping ahead. And you know, it's a good topic of discussion if you ever want to just probe that. My opinion is that he's too busy to get on to other things, and so that could have been a moment if he was a therapist where he could have really elaborated on that and expanded on it. You know, it's not just leaping and leaping ahead. It's kind of, you know, two-way thing. I think you could really expand on it, and that probably, you know, just as you've got so many existentials, you've got so many ways of showing how solicitude shows up. He's got a particular term. I think this is really important, particularly in the work that I've found in my work with clients. Is a German term. It's das Man. If you think about the ways in which we conform, you know, we're in a society, we're immersed in our everyday practices, and it involves conforming to conventions, to practices, to norms, to routines. We need them. You know, we are thrown into them from the get-go, and in a sense, it's not that we're kind of, for most of us anyway, we're not gauging, you know, where am I in relation to things. It's something that we kind of sense, you know. We know how to stand in the queue in Tesco's. We know we sit down at dinner with other people, how to conduct this. So, you know, there's a kind of norm, there's kind of convention. And so we conform and comply to that way, you know, being. The issue really becomes one of, well, could I be over-compliant? Could I be so vigilant about the way in which I'm being that it kind of becomes stifling, you know, that it pervades my existence in a way that somehow imprisons me, traps me. I think a good way, if you like traveling and you go abroad and you go to, you know, other countries, other cultures, it's a great way of seeing how, you know, how things are when you come back. You really get a sense of the way we do things here. And it sometimes can surprise you and you think, oh, why do we do that? You know, why do we get so engrossed in this way? You know?
Like falling in with the day self. Yeah, that's man.
Yeah, that's it. That's great. So, you know, it's a kind of, I mean, to put it in terms that may be relevant to therapy, there's a kind of way in which das Man and being with kind of have a sort of interplay. You know, I can be with you and I don't want to take any risks. You know, what's the norm here? How do I behave? How do I conduct myself so I don't annoy or somehow, you know, become I don't know, you know, perhaps rejected or seen in a strange way, so that I kind of feel somehow at odds or alienated. So for me, you know, those are two key existentials when I think of working as a therapist. I mentioned mood. You know, it's a very difficult term when you take it in the German, and it's so difficult to translate. And this is the difficulty we have with translating Heidegger. But you know, you could talk about disposedness. You could talk about disposition. There's been other ways of translating it. But if you think of that kind of that atmosphere in which you live, that kind of overarching mood in which you live, is kind of so in the background, you know.
That's the existential. We always already have an understanding of how to be. So understanding is an existential. And earlier I mentioned how there's Heidegger just switches around, he takes an everyday meaning and then he switches it around so that it has a different meaning. But it's not like, I'm exploring something and I'm looking at something and I'm trying to, get to grips with it and then immersing myself in that, I eventually come to an understanding of it. It's the complete opposite. It's like I always already have an understanding of how to stand in the queue. It's already there. And he elaborates on that and he adds certain terms so that he nuances it and gives you a very rich kind of account through interpretation, articulation, assertion. All these terms are kind of woven into that so that you get to understand what understanding, in a richer way. I've got to move on. So discourse, possibility, projection, possibility. Projection, sense, I mentioned, truth, ending, totality, and there are others. I think of being towards death is an existential. I think of embodiment as an existential. I think of being centered as an existential. How we try to gauge how to get into an optimal relation to others, to our environment, to whatever it is. There's something about being embodied, but in a kind of, more sort of way of centering ourselves. I think Rollo May uses that term, centering, centered. But I think there's some scope to explore that. So there's lots more. Let me get on to formal indication, because I think I'm more or less coming to the end now. So I'm trying to think of the quickest way I can do it. If I start working with a client, maybe I can use an example. The everyday sense of say, a client coming to me and saying, well, death, let's say. So, or anyone, engaging in conversation about death. What's the first thing we think of? Well, it's an event. Death is an event. It's at the other end of life, the other pole of life. Life and death. There's death, and that's the way we think of it. And it's got a kind of third-person sense to it. So that's the kind of everyday sense that we have of it. What Heidegger does is he takes these terms, death, guilt. In fact, any of the moods you can, like not guilt, but resentment or resignation or acceptance or anything, that there's a mood of some kind. You start from an everyday understanding of it, and you can then start to engage with that and try to bring out the phenomenon. Because in its everyday sense, it's hiding something. It hasn't uncovered something. This is what Heidegger means by truth. Truth isn't, I'm thinking something, whatever it is, and that there's a state of affairs there that corresponds to what I'm thinking. So if I'm thinking that the cat is on the mat, and there is a mat, and there's a cat that sits on that mat, that thought corresponds to an actual state of affairs. That's what truth is. So that's truth as representation. That's the everyday understanding we have of truth. There are other ideas that we have about truth. Truth as coherence, we could go on. But that's the common way that we understand what truth is about, what it means. Heidegger's saying, no, there's something much more primordial when we talk about truth. It's the way something is unconcealed, is revealed. So what he's trying to do is use formal indication. He's saying, look, take the form, take the structure of guilt. Let's think of it as a structure. Rather than, engaging with the content of it. I'm really doing this fast, so, let's just take the structure of it and interrogate the structure of it. so that we can figure out what the elements are, and we can, move it from what we start from and bring out some of the elements so that we can understand something more about the phenomenon, about guilt, about death. So the way that he does it with guilt, but with death, is that he will start from death as an event. He will then start to think about how it points to something. So that's the kind of question sense, indicating, formal indication. So the form is the structure, indication is what is it pointing to? What is it pointing towards? So it's saying this isn't it. This is not, what we want to get to, as it were, as a phenomenon. Because it's the third person common way of speaking. It's kind of got its kind of conventional, everyday sense of what we understand by it. So we want to kind of probe it, look at it, use phenomenology, try to open it up, see what's there, what's not showing itself. And that's what formal indication is doing. It's actually uncovering it so that we actually we come to the next point, which is this distinction between one says, there's perishing, everything perishes, every single thing perishes on this planet, living thing. But we perish, but something different about our way of perishing, and he calls it demising or demise. We come to an end. We demise in the sense that we kind of move from being alive to entering into something about things, about our living, as it were, shutting down, ending, coming towards an end. So in that, he's starting to introduce something of the temporal. What we had was an event at the beginning, but he's introducing into his exploration, into his investigation, something of the fact that we are temporal beings, and that something of his interrogation has to somehow touch upon the temporal aspect. That I'm a being that's coming towards an end. So now I'm kind of opening this phenomenon of death. That seems to be getting closer to what we mean when we talk about death in the sense that we want. It's getting away from the static. It's getting away from this kind of solid thing to something, again, as I say, the temporal, and that we are coming towards an end. So it's a kind of movement where he's now starting to bring it closer to us, so that it's got an existential sense. That formal indication, constant indicating. What's this indicating? Where are we? How do we probe that? We arrive here. Now, what's wrong with that? What's missing? That's phenomenology. Let's turn it a bit. Let's see whether it's got some other element to it that we're missing. You turn something round and you see what was at the back now in the front. So what was hidden is now unconcealed, opened up for me to see. And what was revealed is now concealed. And that's true. There's a dynamic relation between concealing, revealing, concealing, revealing. That's what truth is in its primordial sense. And that's the sense of, how he's conducting this investigation in this example and in others with regard to death. So what's the existential sense of death? This is where he arrives at, as it were. The existential sense of death is that I'm dying, I'm living in a dying way. I'm mortal. So I'm, always, as it were, living in a way that's mortal, dyingly, as it were. I'm kind of embracing the fact that death is part of existence, it's part of life. And there is something about the way in which that informs the way that I live. The realization that death, my death, is my death. It's my unique, almost death. Someone else can't step in and substitute themselves to do it for me. I have to do my death. That kind of brings it into a very existential focus. So it's my death, it's non-relational, you know, I don't know, there can't be some way in which I bring someone else in and we kind of, you know, have some way of stepping in some way or understanding in some way. And it's unsurpassable. I can't kind of outstrip them. I can't get behind them. No, I don't know. Because I'm living, you know, it's a living phenomenon in a sense. Can't really kind of go on the other side of it and look back and think, right, now I've got a handle on it. That's not the existential sense we have of being mortal. It's kind of it outstrips our ability to gain some kind of understanding of it in a way.
I know I'm chipping in loads here, but of course people do deny death in various ways.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm thinking of a client of mine. I maybe even want to say, what about people that are sort of religious and deny it in it? Maybe they think we're wrong. And then I wondered about that when he talks about relating to death, because it makes me think we can relate to our own death in that sense. You know, I think, in the sense that you know, we don't always take up the position you're talking about, which is that we will accept it's going to happen in the same way across the world.
No, I think, I mean, we all have our own, you know, that's the thing. We kind of actualize in our own particular ways all these different existentials, including being towards death. You know, I make sense of it in my way. Someone who is religious, let's say, would have their own way of doing that. I think that there's something about the inescapability of the fact that I'm mortal. And
because he talks about dread, doesn't he? Dread, that we're left hanging.
Yeah, that's right. There's the dread and the sense of, you know, not being able to, as I say, get behind it, not being able to reckon with it in some way. But what it does do is that it can open you up. You know, if there's a way in which you orient yourself to it, ironically maybe, or paradoxically, or whatever the word is, it kind of alerts you to the fact that it's my existence I'm living. And I have to face up to it rather than flee from it, you know, in my way of reckoning with it. So in facing up to it, now what? You know, how do I live my temporality? How do I live in a temporal sense? How am I spending my time? Does that become irrelevant? You know, if I'm teaching, do I really want to teach anymore? I haven't got long. You know, I don't know, 30 years, you know, but I want to spend this time in a way that's meaningful. You know, that kind of reorients me in terms of my existence and what's important to me in a way that was different before I was immersed in that death as an event starting point. You know, when death is an event, perhaps someday, you know, the common way we think of it is, well, you know, what do you want to talk about death for? Getting morbid again, you know, it's like, let's get away from that. It's about, you know, something more exciting. But actually, you know, when you do open yourself to it, there's a possibility that it opens up. My parents, well, I had 3 deaths in the course of 3 years. My brother-in-law, who was 54, which was a complete shock. And then my mother, and then my father. You know, even though my parents were in their old age, it's that kind of sense of, my God, this now brings me, you know, ever closer to the realization, the understanding, I really am going to die. I really am going to die. Now I'm kind of alive to that. It's not as if it's kind of once and for all. It's a kind of way of, you know, sometimes you go about your everyday affairs. You know, you need the everyday, you need the way in which you immerse yourself. But there's moments where it does kind of bring you back to that question. My existence is mine, and I'm the only one that can address it for me in my way. So what if, I think I'll be finishing. Otherwise, we won't have any time for questions. Should we? Hopefully, I've given you a little bit of sense of formal indication. If you you've got some sense of it, it will be something of the kind of hermeneutic process, you know, a way in which something moves in the questioning and is attending to the structure. So if you stay with the content all the time, you're kind of immersed in one thing, but you're not engaging in the way in which this is structured. When you get to see the structure of something, you can identify the elements, and any of those elements can actually give you a way in to seeing how you can explore with the client any one of those elements that they're holding and keeping in place. And they've got their particular way of making sense of, you know, whatever it is, guilt or anger or whatever, you know, being in the world, being mortal. But I'll leave it there because I think that I'd like to hear what you guys think and whether you've got any questions, and give me a chance to just have a drink. And,
Any thoughts, questions, comments, criticisms?
I've got a little tiny question just about when you were describing Wilder, you said there were 3 components and the project was one that I latched onto, but I couldn't
yeah, I mean,
the other 2.
yeah, it's not something that Heidegger talks about. It's something I found in a book called Disclosing New Worlds. I think it's Spinoza and Dreyfus and Flores, the authors. And they're 3, well, I think Dreyfus is a Heidegger scholar, but the other 2 are his former students. But they talked about world in terms of these 3 elements. One is identity. You know, so I use the example of being a therapist, and I'm in the world of therapy. And so that world provides me with a certain sense of identity. It's not like it's, you know, it's now and forevermore. You know, I can end that identity if I stop being a therapist, and then I take up another identity. Or I've got self-identities, you know, I'm in different worlds. I don't know. If I'm a musician, I'm in the world of music. Those 3 elements. The other is what Heidegger calls equipment. And it's, you know, the way I try to put it is, how do I equip myself with all those various, let's say, things or aspects that I need, that are required in order for that world to make it work. So I need clients. You know, that's how I equip myself with being in that world as a therapist. I need books. I need, you know, contact. I need conversations. I need questioning or whatever it is. You know, I need those things. I need to renew my membership. Various accrediting bodies. So is that right? Yeah.
Could you say a bit more about the link between these sort of existential and formal indication?
Yeah. Well, I think that the way that Heidegger puts it, and I think the way that, you know, someone comes into the session and they might be, I'll use the example of death, it might be guilt. So the formal indication is a way of starting with the process of questioning and attending to the form, the structure, and really through that process of formal indication, what's this pointing to? What's it indicating? Moving towards, and what it ultimately moves towards is the existential.
Okay.
Yeah. So I didn't make that clear. You're right to ask. Yeah. So I'd be seeing that this is a particular way of being disposed towards in the world. Yeah.
Questioning.
Yeah. So if we're in a conversation session, you know, so I hear you mention guilt. So we know what that is, but I'm wondering how you're using that word. You know what that means. Well, it's I feel like it was in a scenario. I was in a situation where I did something that I shouldn't have. You know, let's say, you know, what would be, I didn't do something I should have. You know, but the should is already, you know, so in our kind of conversation, something is being disclosed, something's being opened up, and it's pointing. I'm never kind of saying, right, should, now, you know, we've got it. You know, which would be a temptation, wouldn't it? I mean, should is a powerful. Oh, there's all these possible existential. There's kind of, well, should actually, that's one, you know, way in which I can form, you know, and so on and so forth. But let me just hold off, you know, let me engage in this process of trying to stay with the form of it, the structure of it, and see what shows up, and how I can invite a certain movement along, you know, this process of questioning. Always thinking that it's always indicating. That indicating is in principle never ending really. But you know, for the purposes of Heidegger's work, it's pointing towards what's the existential here. And so I said, you know, the client says I said something I shouldn't have. Say more, you know, say more, or we, you know, well, in what way, how, you know. And the client might say something on the lines of, well, you know, I devalued myself in some way because I hold myself to a certain value, you know, or certain standards, or whatever it might be, let's say. And I've fallen from that imaginary standard that I hold towards myself. That's not who I want to show up as, how I want to be. So they're already, you know, opening up something a bit more than where we started from. And it's got the should, it's got the way in which they kind of feel that they've fallen from something, they value themselves through that lapse, you know, and so on. And then we continue the process of questioning what's this pointing towards. And there might be a sense of, well, maybe I should take a shortcut because I could keep going with this, but you know, well, I'm culpable. I deserve to be punished. You know, I can't forgive myself. You know, all these are woven into the structure of guilt in a way. But what you're doing, really, what we're doing is where we're seeing something, and this might not be where it can lead to ultimately, but let's say it does. That we're trying to kind of move it from, well, you know, what one does, this is what one should or shouldn't do, and so on and so forth. So it's got some element of the third person in it, although it's about them. But where is the kind of more existential sense? It's the sense of, you know, if we arrive there, it will be the sense of the way that Heidegger puts it. And this needs some unpacking, so, you know, don't get fazed by this too much. But he talks about guilt being the null basis of a nullity. So what he means by that is, you know, I had to kind of engage in some way or other in the situation, and I went that way. And so now I took that possibility, but there were other possibilities, you know, in a way. I mean, there were other ways that I could be, but I'm always standing out in my existence because I need to engage with the situation that I'm in. And so I've, in a way, taken up one possibility, and then I might get, you know, that was the wrong possibility. Now I'm feeling really guilty, you know, because that's created a lot of shit there, whatever that might be. But the added element to it, as well as that, is that I'm a null basis, which means that the buck stops with me. You know, my existence, there's no one that I can reach to and say, well, he told me to, or you know, forgive me, but let's say it was, you know, if we're living in medieval times, you know, it was God's will. And I can't say, well, God had a role in this, so, you know, it was. Or some entity or some super entity or something or other, you know, that could say, well, something or other told me that this was the right thing to do. You can't get out of it. It's your existence, and you're the null basis. The basis is your basis. There's no other basis. It's null. here's where it stops me. And so that guilt is more existential in the sense that it's the null basis of a nullity. It's the nullity of closing off other possibilities because I went down that possibility. And as well as that, to add to it, is that I'm the null basis. I have to go basis, own up to it. But the thing about it is that, because conscience is woven into it, unless you don't have a conscience, and Dostoevsky is great at exploring, how there were particular individuals who didn't have a conscience, and he was shocked by it. But if you do have a conscience, then, and that's woven into guilt, then that's part of being human. Guilt is my existential condition.
Yeah, this is Kierkegaard, right?
This has got some Kierkegaard, yeah, that's right.
So the idea that you've got to choose, you've got to sort of, you've got to make a choice.
Yeah, exactly.
It's more than just you've got to choose. I think a lot of what you're saying is making me think of one thing he says. There's a line somewhere where he talks about appropriating the new.
Yeah.
So it's starting to look up what you're doing and say, what decisions have I made to get here? Which is then he's talking about intentionality. What's behind? Why am I here? Why am I on a therapy course?
Yeah.
So it's sort of, it's weird because appropriation has got like lots of negative connotations in culture at the moment, doesn't it? Cultural appropriation, so on and so forth. But actually, he wants us to appropriate, so what is I could blame my sort of, if a car nearly ran me over and I spat on the windscreen or something, I could blame my anger. What's my anger constitute? And then again, maybe what you just said about like your slightly, how would Freud talk about it in terms of your conscience? Anyway, what's your conscience comprised of? And it'd be easy to blame your conscience on the fact that you just feel like you've always had it, but actually, maybe it's constituted of something of, some decisions you made long ago about how you think the world should be.
Yeah. I mean, these are all important things. There's something about the very specific way, because as I said earlier, with being time, he's very specific, about the way in which he's pushing this and the direction that he is. So he's using these terms and then confining them to the way that he wants to include them, if you see what I mean. So he talks about the call of conscience. It's a silent call. And it's not, it's a kind of call of conscience to your own existence. What am I doing with my life? It's not like, I hear a voice going, what's going on with you? It's a kind of, it's almost like as if it's something intuitive, but it's kind of, maybe uneasiness, I've been living this way. I've been doing this job for years. Do I really want to? Is this really what I want? Is this? But in the sphere of existence as a whole, my existence it is in question. How am I living? How am I existing? What do I, you wouldn't use value, but let's say, what do I value? What's important to me?
But presumably then that's changing because it would be your conscience that perhaps silently spoke or telling you to do the thing that is later you're kind of thinking, why am I doing this? So presumably it's changing or growing or...
Yeah. I think so long as it's it's addressing your existence at that the level of existence. So how am I existing in my being? He's using that because he wants to distinguish between the way that I can exist that is sort of nicely situated in a world in which I can relax and get by in being part of the norm. The norm is the way in which I feel grounded because I'm doing, what one does. I'm able to feel protected by that, cocooned by it. And I don't need to go the extra mile or anything to somehow challenge myself, because I'm doing, what other people would say, yeah, that's the right thing to do. But if I go out on a limit, or if I sort of think, well, is that what I really want? Is that what, I can kind of live a life that says, well, 99.99% of people would say, well, great, but is it really speaking to me? And I've had clients in the past who have kind of got to that point where they think, well, I've got a good job, career, pay, house, even professions like being doctors. I've been really successful, but something isn't working. I've been a good student. I've got all the A grades. It's been like this. It's like what do I really want? Is this, is it status? Is it money? Is it the recognition? Is that what I want? How important is that? Is it really that, I've kind of immersed myself in a way of life that's emphasised that to the exclusion of what I want? Is it Gauguin who went, left France and went to become a painter in far off, Tahiti or whatever?
Would I ask, do you think there's a risk that the existentials might create a form of enframing in some ways? And I'm thinking in terms of that we might end up in quite a calculative way of thinking, that A equals B and we move to here, we move to there, rather than a sense of unfolding in the room in a potentially a creative language, a language you don't know is coming, language that you don't know you're going to use until you use it. That something unfolds in a situation. And that maybe sometimes we might frame an existentiality that we might start to seek. Here we go. You said this word, now we go left, now we go right. So do you think there's a danger we could fall into that sometimes rather than meditate?
No, you're absolutely right. You're using the right words, the enframing. And
technology.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. It's a very good point. And this is why it's kind of for me helpful to read some of what follows. Some of the later work, where it's a kind of way of Heidegger's always looking at what he's written or what he's said and reviewing it and having a way of critiquing that and criticizing it. So that's the formal indication of work in a way. Now we've set up, and I've told you about the existentials. Now we can go away and do a formal indication. What's here for us to go on questioning? How do we engage and work in a way that doesn't entrap us in how other therapeutic approaches might be doing it, So I think you're bang on, you're spot on, and it's a challenge for me. I'm thinking of how those existentials, how do we understand them in terms of Heidegger's later philosophy, fourfold, and some of the work that he did quite late on. That to me is much more important.
Yeah, and he definitely returned to it. He returned to it in a very different style, but really interesting stuff. Yeah.
But I guess that'll be for another time. Maybe we can explore how that might work. I'd be interested in what you might think, because I mean, the more I try to get into Heidegger, the more I realise I don't actually. It's kind of always pulling the rug from under your feet, and you're thinking, never settle into something. Maybe I've given the impression that this is now, done and dusted. We've got them, just carry on looking at the existentials. But even with the existentials, it's kind of trying to understand what it is about being human. I think that's the vital question. What brings us back? So if that much has been achieved, then I think that's the important thing.
And that's ever changing, isn't it? What it means to be human in terms of technology and what people in the room, are they in the room?
Yeah.
Are we in the room with them? It's all big thing.
Yeah. I think if you that's why I was really wanting to introduce the methodology, because when you go back to the approach, he's never, as I said at the very beginning, he's never settled upon something. It's like, as soon as exactly what you were saying, Patricia, as soon as you feel now this is kind of getting, let's say, encrusted, he goes, right, open it up, because it's got to have a certain way of moving as an inquiry. That's what I think I really take from.
Is there something of it being a sort of philosophical phenomenology, a way of looking at things rather than a list or a
that's
or
right.
a diagram?
That's right. Yeah. That's exactly. So I didn't mention the word. I mentioned it once maybe, but hermeneutics. There's the way he engages in this hermeneutic inquiry. That I think is the basis for his work. If you read any of his work, actually, I think you can find it in Question Concerning Technology or any of the work. He's starting somewhere and then he moves it and he says, well, these are the four causes. This is the way you can think about it. That's, and then he moves on to something else, and then he goes, well, that's not, and he keeps going, and he then arrives there, something I mentioned, fourfold. But I've got colleagues who have said, well, why a 4? Why not 7? Why not 9? Why not 12? Why not
21 existentials?
Yeah. I mean, you could just, and then, if Heidegger were alive today, he'd probably say something else. He'd be saying, well, I've had a go at doing a fourfold or the existentials. Let me try something else now. So in that sense, you're right. We can have different ways of seeing. Taking different paths on how we see what it is to be human, rather than this one. I think that's the danger, that we get locked into one. And this is. I mean, I don't know. You might disagree with this, and that'd be great, because there's the occasion when we can open into discussion. But metaphysics tries to say, right, this is it. This is what it is.
Well, we can't quite catch it. Can
No,
we?
that's right.
That's the thing.
No, it's gone.
Yeah, but it is. Thank you very much for it's opening up stuff for us. Without us sort of then going from that. It's to how do we continue to open up?
Yeah.
We kept opening up. How do we sort of find going?
Yeah.
Some notions that we say without becoming a fixed position.
Yeah.
Where we end up, painting by numbers.
That's
And,
right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.